It truly is an honor to be here with you. I want to say thank you in a very special way to Dr. Zach Pontak. I don't know where Zach went. There you are, Zach, back there. Zach is very convincing. I want to say thank you to Zach and to the ASRS team, to Rodney for his kind words. Back in the years when I had the privilege of working with Jerry Winslow at what is now the School of Religion there at Loma Linda University, this was an annual conference that I absolutely loved attending. Since moving over to the church side, it just so happens that the weekend of this conference coincides with one of the biggest weekends of our church year. And so it has made it almost impossible for me to attend. But it's very good to be back in these environs and very good to be with you. As I listened to the panel discussion this morning, listened to the theology, the wisdom, the insights, the training, I thought of Matthew 3:14. I need to be baptized of thee. Comest thou to me? And I thought, I'm not sure what I'm doing here, but here I am. It really is truly, though, a privilege. It appears that God had gotten word that the world was in desperate shape. It had gone sideways. Most people were in adamant opposition, rebellion, and sin. So God called two of his most trusted angels and said, would you go down and check this out? Is this true? And they went. And they returned and they said, it's not only true, it's worse than we thought. There are 95% who live in darkness, opposition, trouble. 5% were faithful and good. And God thought, that can't be right. I'll get a second opinion. Called two other trusted agents, sent them earthward. They came back with the very same message. 5% on the straight and narrow, 95% lost. It moved God to sit down behind the heavenly computer and send an email. He sent an email to the 5%, wanting to encourage them, to assure them. Do you know what that email said? Do you know what it said? I was just checking because I didn't get one either. I feel a bit relieved then to be with other sinners in need of grace. So among us 95%, I looked at the conference topic, religion and trauma. It's a very powerful topic, honestly. I've had the privilege of spending a great deal of my life with people facing such things. If I thought I could get away with it and still get my airline ticket paid, I would, after Daniel Duda's imaginations and prayers, have stood up and offered the benediction. Truly, that is all we need. Thank you. From my heart and soul. But I didn't think I could get away with it, Leo, so I thought I'd better say something. So I want to throw out to you a line. I wonder if you would agree with this line. I don't want you to agree or disagree too quickly, but to consider it. To consider whether or not there is truth to what it says. Here's the line. The character of the God we serve determines the caliber of the life we live. Just that. The character of the God we serve determines the caliber of the life we live. So what the statement is saying is how we understand God, how we know God, how we experience and assimilate God is formative. So formative, in fact, that it will form most everything else about our lives. If that is true, then how we understand that character is ground zero. There may be nothing more urgent and important than that. Because our very lives, and I would even say our common life, gets shaped from that. So that's the line. The character of the God we serve determines the caliber of the life we live. I would never have thought of it in that way as a child growing up, but I certainly experienced the reality of it. Growing up in a conservative Adventist home, mostly in Latin America, but also in Texas, meant that the Adventism that I experienced and that gave birth to my life and my faith was stringent and strict. Looking back, I wonder if some of the conclusions I drew were totally from that, or maybe from temperament and overactive conscience. I can't tell you with absolute certainty, but what I can tell you is this. As an adolescent, as a young teenager, I became concerned about whether or not I had committed the unpardonable sin. And it was no joke. It seared itself into my soul. Conversations with a few friends and a few people who were a bit more advanced made me realize that I was not alone in that concern. I remember to this very day the sermon from a well-known Adventist evangelist with that title, The Unpardonable Sin. By the time the sermon was over, I was devastated. Now, I want you to just ponder that. Ponder that. An adolescent, wet behind the ears, still very much within the embrace of mom and dad, so fearful of God. And it makes me want to ask God the question, good God, what have we done to you? The character of the God we serve determines the caliber of the life we live. And the years passed. I had seminary and I had, thank God, Ivan Blazin, who began to rewrite the script for me, who introduced me to a new understanding, to a new freedom. But much of those old scripts could still be revived without too much effort. I got to thinking about this last weekend. Our son Austin was ordained in Ohio. We had the privilege of being there and participating. And it got me to thinking back on the day of my ordination. Anita and I, we were not yet married, but on our way there. We were walking up toward the facility where the ordination for a number of us in that conference was to be held. As I was walking up, I encountered a gentleman, a pastor, who was much further down the road than I was. He looked at me for a moment, recognized me, said, aren't you being ordained this afternoon? I said, yes, I am. He said, how do you feel? I said, pretty overwhelmed, pretty unworthy. He said, well, let me give you a piece of advice that has been helpful to me over the years. And I was all ears. After all, this is kind of a Paul and Timothy moment, right? He said to me, I have discovered over the years that if you will take a paper clip and attach it, you got to run the back part of your tie through that circle. But if you attach it there and then attach it to your shirt, your tie won't blow all over the place and you won't get criticized for wearing a tie clasp. Scouts on. Let that rattle around for a while. Someone in ministry for decades, giving wisdom to someone entering ministry about paper clips and tie clasps. Good God, what have we done to you? I remember the couple. She was in the bed, held together by pulleys and weights, her broken, bruised, battered body made that way by the collision of two automobiles. Her husband sat nearby. They had called for the chaplain. And so I came, and he gave me the background and the story. A child long prayed for, long desired, all kinds of attempts and efforts to have just one. And finally, all the prayers, all the tears, all the hopes, all the work was rewarded. She was the apple of their eye. A year and a half into her life, Mom had her in the car seat, driving down Magnolia Avenue in Riverside, California, where somebody took a drink and then took a drive and then took a life. That baby. And now she called for the chaplain. I had to lean in close to be able to hear her words, fighting my own tears after that story. Her question was simple. What did I do? Why is God punishing me? I am angry at God and afraid to admit it because I may not see her again. Ponder that. A woman, a childless mother, feeling an anger that not only is understandable, but what else would you feel? And now fearing that that emotion would eternally separate her from God. Good God, gracious God, what have we done to you? It's less than 100 miles from where we sit this morning that the sermon was preached, getting close to 3 centuries ago, not quite, getting close, July 9, 1741, Enfield, Connecticut. He was a stellar mind, a brilliant mind. In fact, the church historian W.W. Sweet has said, in many respects, Jonathan Edwards is the outstanding figure of colonial America and has been generally recognized as one of the greatest minds America has produced. Sterling mind. A.M. Fairbairn has added, he is not only the greatest of all the thinkers that America has produced, but also the highest speculative genius of the 18th century. And so he stood in the desk and delivered his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Brilliant mind, accepted at Yale at 13, I read. Could defend himself in Greek and Hebrew and Latin by that age. Brilliant. But he was apparently a rather small man, not much when it came to physical presence. And if I read the right sources, he apparently read his sermon, his head down, reading the words that were on the page. It wasn't the fiery bombast that sent terror into the hearts of his listeners. From Clyde Fant and William Pinson in 20 centuries of great preaching come these words, who can estimate aright the feeling which his pale and frail presence produced when the preacher stood calm in his pulpit while the distressed and convicted multitude wept around him. His very self-repression, significant of a reserved power, his wasted form and thin voice, suggestive of a being coming from the gates of death, and his eye, when it was lifted, so piercing that it was profanely said on one occasion to have knocked the bell rope in the steeple so that the bell fell with a crash into the church. That's the preacher. And he preaches. As people weep, and it is reported that some fainted, and that one even near him cried out, but does God not have mercy? What could cause such fear? 2 simple paragraphs, not long, from the sermon, which you can read, but not before bed. Listen to his words. The bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string. And justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Not enough? Here's the second paragraph I chose. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. Let's stand for the benediction. Gracious God, good God, what have we done to you? Every preacher, I suppose, has her or his favorite sermons, possibly to deliver, but that's not what I'm referring to. Favorite sermons which she or he has heard, which have been indelibly inscribed into their hearts and memories. I can name some of mine, but I focus on just one today. Sermon I heard years ago now, but which has become unforgettably a part of my life and experience, preached by the homiletician Haddon Robinson. Those of you who took undergraduate theology or seminary homiletics may possibly have used his biblical preaching book. Robinson's sermon built on the story of Jephthah in the Old Testament. Robinson's sermon expresses its content in its title. The sermon is The Danger of a Strong Faith and a Weak Theology. The danger of a strong faith and a weak theology. If my theology, will say Archbishop William Temple, whom we will read in a bit, if my theology is out of balance, is askew, is in error, then the more deeply and the more firmly I believe it, the worse it will be for me and for those around me. It goes back to ground zero, to how we understand God. And if the contemporary examples aren't enough, just consider some of the realities we find in merely perusing the pages of this book. We barely open the book before we see the couple running, the man holding and pulling the woman. Run, run, he's coming, run. And then that first question in Scripture pierces the air. Where are you? The substance of the answer can be captured in 3 of its words. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of you, God. you continue to peruse the pages of the book, and you do come to that story. That Jephthah story, surely it must be, if not the worst, in the top 2 or 3 in the entire canon. That story of a man who sacrifices his child because of a vow he has made to the God of his understanding, a God who in other places has said, you will do no such thing. Now be careful not to be too quickly judgmental, because he will not be the last father to sacrifice his child on the altar of professional advancement. But he does. And we say, good God, what have we done to you? And we continue reading. Over to the 8th chapter of Job, where his friends are, with friends like these, who needs enemies? His friends gathered around him. Bildad the Shuhite says to him, Job, your kids must have committed sin, so they were being justly punished. That's what God had to do. Gracious God, what have we done to you? So we skip through the rest of that part of the book and come to the New Testament. Maybe there's something better there, only to find ourselves peering in on the scene, on the road to Damascus, where the man shields his eye from the divine epiphany. And from his soul, the soul of this man who has persecuted to the death people who are not following the God of his understanding, from his soul is squeezed the question, who are you, Lord? Who are you? Maybe that's the question that many need to ask. Who are you? The words are from Haddon Robinson's sermon. The danger of a strong faith and a weak theology. I don't know, says Robinson, talking to people like us. I don't know if you've been to some of the conferences I've been to, but I've heard people stand up and say, look, preachers, look, I don't preach theology. I think people need to have an experience of God. I think people need to know how to relate. And so what I'm into is helping people when they come to church to have an experience. I don't give much time to theology. Well, says Robinson, I thought, you go to a doctor. You say to the doctor, I got a pain in my stomach. The doctor says, well, you need to know I don't pay too much attention to medicine. I took that stuff at school, but I haven't paid much attention to it. What I'm into is bedside manner. I want people to feel comfortable around me. Look, why don't we just cut you open and see what's inside? And says Robinson, not your knife, not my stomach. It sounds so good, doesn't it? We're into giving people an experience of God. But if you have a deep faith in God and you have a shallow theology, you'll be giving yourself to superficiality and you'll give yourself to nonsense, and you can do great damage to yourself and to others. What was our statement? The character of the God we know determines the caliber of the life we live. So what do we do with theology? You know better and longer than I do that it's at its core a pretty simple concept. Theos, God, Logos, Word. It's words about God theology. Last week at our son's ordination, I told the story of my son who was a theologian even in his young years. I can remember Driving in the car, I'm not sure where Anita was that day, but I had both kids in the back seat, strapped in their car seats, although they were almost big enough to be free. I'm driving along and I hear Miranda say, "Daddy, Austin's looking at me." Austin, stop looking at me. "Daddy, Austin's looking at me more." "Austin." "Daddy, now he's staring at me." "Well, then just look out the window." And thus went the drive home. We drove into the garage, and by then I'd had it up to here. I was done with what was going on in the back seat. Austin was just old enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt, jumped out, landed on the floor of the car, was just the size where he could stand on the floor of the car, and his head just touched the roof of the car, the ceiling. He was going to get out, but I turned around and I asked him an impossible question for a young person to answer. I said, "Austin, why? Why are you always pestering your sister? Why?" He actually looked offended at the question. He kind of pulled back and his face flushed a bit. He looked at me and he said, "You know why. Because there's sin in the world." Not bad theology. We all have a theology. I would suggest that even a person who says, "I don't believe in your God," has a theology. If theology is words about God, what comes to mind first when we think about God? When that word is mentioned, what do I see? What is my experience? What do I understand? Theology. So where do we go in the pages of this book to begin with, to start with our theology? Those of you who have spent literally your lives studying this will correct me, no doubt, and will have far more to say than I ever could. But I will tell you this. If given the chance to just use one passage to begin to form my theology, my understanding of God, I would squeeze in beside a wealthy Jewish church leader and an itinerant Galilean rabbi in the moon-kissed garden, and I would listen to these words. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Amen. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. For God so loved the world. You Johannine scholars have told the rest of us that in John's gospel, that Greek word cosmos, world, often refers to the world in its antipathy against God, the systems of opposition against God, those who want nothing to do with God, the 95%. Us. The world there means those who have made choices that are bigoted and sexist and damaging and destructive. And John says, God so loved the world. I find myself in recent months, the last year or two, going back to this verse time and again, trying to mine it for its depths. God so loved the world. so loved us that he doesn't come to condemn, but to save. The theologians among us will have to tell me whether I am amiss in beginning there. But it truly is my heart at this point in time. God's matchless, profound, undeserved love. It's for an adolescent fearing the unpardonable sin. It's for a preacher who's into paper clips. It's for a mother bereaved and bereft who weeps out her anger at God. It's even for a preacher who speaks of us sinners in the hands of an angry God. I hope it's different today, but in my growing up, we heard far too little of that. And it led us into some dark places in the church, to deep damage, to deep misunderstandings and shame. It was, to me then, I suppose, like being like a moth drawn to a flame when I came across the preaching and then the writing of one Fred Craddock. Dr. Craddock, who taught New Testament and homiletics at Candler School of Theology, Emory University in Atlanta. We were privileged to host Dr. Craddock at our church years ago. It's the last trip, he told us, last trip I'm taking that involves flying. At Guillain-Barré, I can only stand for one service. We said, come. And he came. I thought about a year later when I attended a conference in Oklahoma, presented by Dr. Craddock and Robert Brown Taylor. I just briefly greeted him in a line of people. I thought I had died and gone to heaven. When in his presentation to this packed house, he said, you know, I was out with the Adventists not long. In fact, I think I saw Randy here. Is Randy? I said, Jesus, just call me over. I was struck when I heard Dr. Craddock years ago say, I reject any notion of God that makes me a better Christian than God is. I reject any notion of God that makes me a better Christian than God is. Where was that in my anxious youth? First book of his I read was As One Without Authority. It was part of the opening wedge into the field of homiletics, of narrative preaching. It was life-changing to me. I wanted to read you a quote from there, but in light of the fact that I highlighted most of the book, it was a bit of a hard decision. But this is that on which I finally landed. If the preaching of the church, wrote Craddock, if the preaching of the church would address the whole person, then let the imagination play over the facts and awaken tired spirits. Many of the parishioners are not so much evil as they are bored. And their entire Christian experience has never provided them a chair in order to sit for an hour in the heavenly places with Christ. They don't need argument. They need air. Why not sermons that celebrate the unconditioned love of God? Instead of using Thanksgiving to scold the ungrateful, why not a doxological message? Instead of the weary harangues against commercialism at Christmas and the attacks against the once-a-year churchgoers at Easter, would it not be just as courageous to announce the good news? Some Sunday mornings, the minister should take the congregation by the hand
take the congregation by the hand, and with them step off the dimensions of their inheritance as children of God. Some of them have been preached at for years, but have never been given a peek into the treasury, much less the opportunity to run their fingers through the unsearchable riches of Christ. Take the congregation by the hand and step off the dimensions of their inheritance as children of God. How wide, how long, how high, how deep. It's as wide as every person, as high as your loftiest dreams, as deep as the most degraded among us. As Ron Halverson Sr. used to say, God saves us from the guttermost to the uttermost. And how long, from eternity past to eternity future, step off the dimensions of our inheritance as children of God. Do you suppose that's why that diminutive woman penned these words? Christ Object Lessons. It is the darkness of misapprehension of God that is enshrouding the world. Men and women are losing their knowledge of his character. It has been misunderstood and misinterpreted. At this time, a message from God is to be proclaimed, a message illuminating in its influence and saving in its power. His character is to be made known. Into the darkness of the world is to be shed the light of his glory, the light of his goodness, mercy, and truth. Why? Because maybe it is true that the character of the God we know determines the caliber of the lives we lead in the world and in the church. Could it be that it's ground zero? That much of the damage that has been created, the trauma that has been experienced, the withholding of grace, the threat of perfectionism, much of it had been driven by a misapprehension of the character of God. Not to take cheap shots, because I am as in need of grace as they were. But I grew up in a world where one unconfessed sin threatened eternity. Many of you are parents. You know what happens when a child goes astray. It is as though everything in your world and your life is focused on love and prayer and communication and connection with that child. And then we assume, we have the temerity to say that we serve a God with whom one unconfessed sin will say, "You're done for eternity." No wonder Dr. Craddock's words washed over my soul. I reject any notion of God that makes me a better Christian than God is. It's formative, not only in the trauma, but in the healing. The character of God. If you'll permit me, 3 other quotes, all very brief, but key names. A.W. Tozer. Were we able to extract from any man or woman a complete answer to the question, what comes to your mind when you think about God? We might predict with certainty, the spiritual future of that man, of that woman. What do you believe about God? Tell me who your God is, and I'll tell you what your life's going to be like. Archbishop William Temple, whom I mentioned earlier, if your concept of God is radically false, then the more devout you are, the worse it will be for you. You're opening yourself to be molded by something base. In terms of your practical life, it would be better to be an atheist. And finally, Oswald Chambers. It is perilously possible to make our conceptions of God like molten lead poured into a specially designed mold. And when it is cold and hard, we fling it at the heads of the religious people who don't agree with us. Isn't it curious? Isn't it curious? Now, God hates all the same people we do. It's ground zero. Who is your God? And so, for me, that's the text. That's the passage. For God so loved the world in all of its sin, in all of its brokenness, in all of its rebellion, in all of its trauma. God so loved the world that he gave. And that's been a problem too. How we understand that giving and the destiny to which it led in a place called Golgotha. It's been years ago, to the best of my, I don't know whom to give credit to for a couple of these things. To the best of my recollection, part of this I heard from J.R. Hoffman maybe in my college years. You'll forgive me if my memory isn't correct. But it has formed my thinking now over many years. How we understand the character of God in that giving act of John 3:16. I heard a dialogue, listened to a preacher ask others, did Calvary change God? Or does Calvary change you? And there were those who put up robust fights for the fact that Calvary changed God. That allowed him to purge himself of the wrath he felt at sin. And others said, no, Calvary changes us. I'll tell you what's been helpful to me. And this is what's not original with me. Is to make a distinction between the crucifixion and the cross. Two events happening simultaneously. The same location, in the same person, at the same moment in time. The crucifixion is what humanity did to God. The cross is what God did for humanity. The crucifixion is Satan at his worst. The cross is God at his best. The crucifixion is evil at its darkest. The cross shows God at his brightest. The crucifixion is the most heinous, dastardly act we could imagine. The cross is the most precious, glorious act that we could envision. The crucifixion is the embodiment, the unveiling of evil. The cross is the embodiment, the unveiling of good. And it all happened in one person, at one place called Calvary, in a concentrated moment, on a Friday called Good, on a hill called Golgotha, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And because of that, maybe, as one person put it, the question is not whether we have sinners in the hands of an angry God. The reality is that at Calvary, we have God in the hands of angry sinners. And shows us who he is. The character of the God we serve determines the caliber of the lives we live. Could that be true? So, Anita and I walked on, thinking about paper clips. Is that the best this day has to offer? We got closer to the venue, and another preacher, also well down the road, looked at me and said, "Aren't you being ordained this afternoon?" I said, "Yes." "How do you feel?" I didn't say this, but I wanted to say not as good as I did a couple of minutes ago. I said, "Well, honestly, fairly overwhelmed." He said to me, "Let me share something that has meant a lot to me." Wish I could say I was all ears. I was partially ears. He said, "The reason you will be up there today, and the only reason you will ever have to minister, is the grace of Jesus. His righteousness, His goodness will preserve you in all the future." And I figured I'd probably better listen, since his name was Morris Vindon. But he was a prophet that day. Because from that day to this, on my worst days, and there have been far more than I wish there had been, the one sustaining reality has been the fact that when John penned the words, "God so loved the world," that He included me, part of the 95%. And I praise Him for it. Amen.